All right, so the Explore performance task. This one has 8 rows as well. It is very similar to the old Explore performance task rubric. We did split 1 row. So row 1 aligns with row 1 on the old Explore task rubric, the one for 2017. The main difference here is that the artifact that the student has to create has to stand on its own a lot more than it did last year. So students were kind of taking the easy way out, and they were providing their explanation of the computing innovation's intended purpose, function, or effect in their written response. And that's no longer going to be acceptable. So if you notice, this is all based on the artifact and not the written response. Where the written response comes in is that we can allow the reader to look at the written response to understand how that artifact does the illustrating, representing, and explaining. And I like to parallel this to if you go to an art gallery and you look at a piece of art, sometimes you don't always understand how it's conveying meaning unless someone comes alongside you and explains it to you. But that it has to explain how. It can't just say, it can't just answer the question and say that, you know, what the computing innovation's intended purpose, function, or effect does. It has to say how the artifact does that. And I have an example of one that would not get points for that this upcoming year. Okay, row 2 and row 3 are very similar to the 2017 rubric. We will be penalizing students who do not choose a computing innovation for 2018. For 2017-2018, they have to choose a computing innovation. Not a lot of students, but some students chose just technology innovations, or they chose a science innovation. This is a computing class that has to have a computer somewhere and involve program code in order for them to get all of the points. If they do not choose a computing innovation, they will not be able to earn row 2 at all. So they have to state a fact about a computing innovation, and if it's not, then we're not going to give them row 2. Something that's a little different when we move on to row 3 and beyond, some students start to, even though they identified one thing as the computing innovation, they start to talk about something else that actually is a computing innovation. Because if you don't have a computing innovation, it's very difficult to talk about data that the innovation uses. And so they make a switch. And we are going to allow them to earn these points as long as what they're describing is a computing innovation. So one example that I can think of is the chip that's in credit cards now, the smart chip. That doesn't have a computer in it. Where the computer is in the chip reader. So what students will do is they'll identify it as the chip, and so they'll miss row 2, but then when they get to row 3 and they start talking about effects, they're actually talking about the chip reader and not really talking about the chip. Same thing with cables. A lot of kids want to talk about wires and cables. The wires and cables don't have the computer. They connect to the computer. So once they start talking about the computer that those wires are connected to, then we're going to let it go, because we're trying to demonstrate that they know something about effects of computing. So once they make that switch, we're going to be okay with it. But it's very, very important that a student chooses a computing innovation for this year. Just one last thing about row 3, and this was the same last year. When they identify one effect, they do not have to say whether it's harmful or beneficial. They just have to identify it as an effect. In row 4, however, now they have to say whether it's beneficial or harmful. So they have to be again, it has to be whatever they're describing is beneficial or harmful. So we will be looking for that there. Needs to be plausible. And the last thing I want to say, I was wondering if there was more highlights on this. The last thing I want to say is that they don't necessarily have to use those words beneficial and harmful, but the intent has to be very clear. So they have to use words that are synonyms of beneficial and harmful. Just saying that it saves lives, while most of us would agree that that would be beneficial, it's not necessarily the saying it's saving lives is not enough to say it's beneficial, because that could be something that some people would view as beneficial and others would view as harmful. So the same effect can have both a beneficial and a harmful effect, depending on the person's perception of that. Somebody had one where it's better quality. Something was better quality, and they were like, well, that's beneficial. Well, it's better quality for the consumer, who then wouldn't have to replace it. But for the person that makes their living repairing things, having something be better quality is not necessarily beneficial to them. So having the effect be, well, it's better quality, you would have to say what the benefit is. The benefit would be, to somebody not having to replace it as often. The harm would be that somebody else might lose work because they don't have enough things to repair because the quality is high. So quality sounds like something that we would all want, but there is, depending on your perspective, there's two sides of that. Okay, so row 5, then they have to. This is the row we split. This was row 4, and we split it into 4 and 5. It was very difficult for readers to keep track of all the things they had to keep track of in row 4, so we split it up. So row 5 now is going to take and explain how one of those effects is related to society, economy, or culture. One of the things that was talked about a lot at the reading was, what did we mean by society, economy, or culture? And how many people does that make up? And so looking at the course and exam description, and what we say there is that the effects have to be connected to a group or individuals. So not just one, right? Individuals, more than one, but it could be groups. So it could be, teenagers could be the group, or it could be elderly, or it could be diabetics, or it could be females. It doesn't have to be all of society. It can be subgroups of society. So it has to be a group or individuals that are being affected by whatever the beneficial or harmful effect is. Okay, and then rows 6 and 7 have to do with the data. These are similar. Some things that people confused, they wanted to say some general things about data. So they wanted to say how the data was collected. So they said, oh, the data is sensor data coming from sensors. Well, a sensor is collecting the data, but sensors can collect all sorts of things. They can collect temperature readings, and they can collect distances between objects and all sorts of things. So students need to be much more specific. They can't just say, they can't just name the collection device. They can't say camera. They would have to say that it's images. So that's the data. The camera is not the data, the images that the camera collects as the data. The other thing was that they were confusing real world objects, like say fingerprints, with how we would collect a fingerprint via an image or a bitmap. So they need to really get down into like what the actual data is. And then for row 7, they have to identify a data storage, data privacy, or data security concern. So this is a little bit, maybe a little bit easier than it was last year, because they don't have to justify it or any of that. They just have to identify it. It does still have to be data related. So it has to be a data storage, data privacy, data security. So for example, they couldn't talk about personal safety. They would have to talk about your data safety. And then row 8 is again on the in-text citations. Do you want to take a few minutes to talk about this just to make sure that we're clear? It is a minimum of 3 in-text citations, and they must be also included in the references. So the way students do their citations, we have not set one way that things have to be cited. However, if you read the plagiarism statement in the CED, it is very clear that anything that is not the student's must be cited. This includes not just for Explore, but also for Create. If they take program code from another student, if they take program code from an open source website, they need to cite anything that they didn't write on any of the performance tasks. So while at their reading, the readers are going to concentrate on making sure they have 3 in-text citations, whatever. We have mechanisms that will check to make sure that students haven't plagiarized. And a student who does not cite everything that they did not contribute themselves will most likely end up in a situation where their work has been flagged for plagiarism. So it's very important that we teach students the right way to do things. Instead of just trying to get them to do the bare minimum of 3, they have to cite everything. Same is true for the artifact. Any images they're using, music, any videos that they're using, those all should be cited, and they can cite them in the artifact or they can cite them in the references section in 2E. Okay, so let's look at some examples quickly, and then we'll get to questions. This is an artifact that I felt like clearly showed, if I didn't know what GPS was, I would understand the purpose of a GPS. And it's got the name of it right on there. I don't need to look at the written response to tell me how this artifact is telling me about the purpose. This next one, however, this EQ radio, when I looked at this, I saw, oh, it picks up the person's heartbeat, it picks up their respiratory system. All right, that's interesting. It must be used for healthcare some way. And then in reading about it, I found out that it's actually about determining someone's emotions. So this artifact here did not provide an illustration, representation, or explanation of the fact that this EQ radio is actually, the purpose is actually to determine someone's emotions. Nowhere does that communicate that to me, and in their written response, they do not address how this artifact would communicate that to me. So this one would not get the points. All right, sample C, 2A, or the rest of these are going to come from sample C. So we're just looking for a fact about the purpose or function, not the effect in this case, because the effect is later on. So this here is a section where it talks about the original purpose of GPS. Row 3, identifying one effect. It increases the safety of children, even teenagers, so that's an effect of GPS. So they would get row 3. That also happened to be their beneficial effect, and they talk about it being a benefit further up in the article, so they would get that first bullet in row 4. The harmful effect, it's a little bit subtle the way the student does this, because they say, while this is very convenient at times, so it's the positive, then they make the switch. People in society have become very reliant on this luxury. I would caution students, if they're going to write this way without calling it out as a harm, to be very, very careful that they have done it in a way that really does convey their meaning that this is now harmful. So this is subtle, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend this as the best way, but the student did earn the point for getting the harmful effect in there, because it causes many people to only trust their GPS, and then they would be unfamiliar with their surroundings. And then the effect on society, and they say more about this, but being able to track your children has a huge benefit to society, and they go on to explain more about that there. All right, 6 and 7, this is on the data. So in general, the data produces location, so they have identified the data. Here is where they explain how that data is being transformed. So using the specific device you're using at the time, the location, you can figure things out, like the directions, the speed, more. That's what's happening. And then here we have a security concern that's being identified in terms of the government tracking people's location, and just needing to be identified. They do a decent job explaining. And then I've kind of hodgepodged a couple of paragraphs together here from this sample, but you can look at all of sample C on AP Central. Here is one of the references. They did this as using strategies such as according to or as described, whatever. I caution you to tell your students, if they're going to use this type of referencing according to Fred, that anything that's directly from the article should be in double quotes. That's how you quote somebody. And according to is really supposed to be that then the students put it in their own words. It's not meant to be a quote. And if they're quoting from text, they need to put it in double quotes. Otherwise, it will be flagged